I'm interested to know what you think are the key skills and qualities and characteristics a chief risk officer needs and why.
Well, we often think about the technical qualities. I mean, modeling, assessing like risk appetite and probabilities and things like that. But at the end, what really matters is more like getting a big picture. I mean, it's no use getting into complex calculation without getting a sense of where you're going. And then often the risks will that may be the most threatening will come from out of nowhere, probably where you don't have stats. And so to be able to get in contact with the people that are closer to the business and get them to think about, okay, so what could go wrong? Give them the liberty to also explore things in terms of scenarios that may not be retained, but that it just helps thinking further.
Let me stop you there, because you mentioned, I heard a lot in what you already gave me. My mind is trying with I want to expand on a couple of points.
Yeah.
One is that you mentioned something I think very important. So technical folks, which we need technical folks in enterprise risk management, they tend to go with what they know, which is some things that can be, they have statistics, they have data, they can model and go deep. But often, a lot of the risks and the bulk of the risks are actually not necessarily in that area. They're more in the strategic risks and the operational risks. And you need to talk to people. And a lot of technical people are not comfortable with the interactions with people. But we need that. You talked about getting the people in the business that are closest to the risks and pulling them out. So now you're referring to, we need communication skills, we need people skills. And you also, I think, are alluding to imagination, because we need to work with them to get them to explore a range of risk scenarios, even those that may not end up credible scenarios, but we need to explore and think about what might happen and start with the originating source and walk it all the way through and see which ones pan out and which ones may evaporate in our hands, but we need to go there.
That's correct. So you need this communication skill to the technical people, so you need to understand some of the technical stuff so that you're able to pass on the message to the people so that you can get this assessment of risk or what's possible. And you also need to take this to the other level, because you also need to communicate to upper management and potentially the board and explain that in again, communication is also very important. So it's both important on getting the information from the base and also passing the information up to upper management.
So I think now you're giving people a picture of how challenging it is to be chief risk officer, because you have to be somebody that you have the technical grounding, you understand finance and technical grounding, you understand risk, you have to understand people and how to interact, and you have to be able to communicate the messages up and down and across and to external parties, so a lot of different customers of the information. So being able to have that executive presence and the communication skills to clarify the message, that's the challenging. So people understand the technical, know what you need, and bridge that gap between the different people from the way they talk about their businesses may be different, to understand that, interpret it, and match it up, and then communicate it out. That's difficult.
Yeah, that's correct. Also thinking, sometimes also as role, you're talking imagination. Once you've done that role for a while, I mean, you tend to keep on raising the same risk. And you need to force yourself and force the people that you're working with to keep on having fresh look at things, as opposed to getting in a mode where I've done that. It's an exercise I do, I don't know, every quarter, I update the numbers, but you still need to refresh yourself, because again, the risks are likely to evolve over time, and you don't want to get into, I guess, an automatic mode. Yeah.
So that's tough, right? So and I talk about this in terms of sometimes of when you're prompting people in a qualitative risk assessment. I say it's always dangerous to give them a list. It's very important to do categorization, risk definitions, but to give people a list and say, here's a list, what do you think? Don't characterize as comprehensive. Say, here's some samples. You want people thinking. You don't want people thinking we've got it covered. Here's a list, here's a process, here's a system, it's automatic. And so almost what you're saying is we need somebody a little paranoid, a little bit humble, right? That maybe we're missing something. It kind of reminds me of like the top coaches of sports teams, right? No matter how well they do, they're never satisfied. They're saying, well, we didn't follow the strategy right, we didn't follow our tactics, we could have done better, even though they won by a large margin. So it's a little bit of paranoia, a little bit of looking for what we missed.
Yes, at the same time, like feet on the ground, on the ground, so that you don't effectively, in terms of paranoia, is yes, in the sense that you want to uncover new things, but you don't want to paralyze the company with being afraid of taking risk.
No.
No.
One of the challenges, probably the number one challenge I hear from chief risk officers is generating buy-in. Right?
Yes.
They can have a great process, but getting buy-in is the most difficult part. So what qualities do you think a chief risk officer needs to be able to negotiate and garner buy-in?
I guess viewing the risk as being like a kind of a balancing act. So I have some risk that we're taking, and we want to be aware of the risk that we are, so we'll be compensated for it. And at the same time, to run the business, we need to take risk. So having somebody that can express that there's a balance there, and it's not all on one side, like all risk avoidance or all profit and risk taking. So getting the balance, and I think if you're talking in terms of balance, it's much likely that you're going to get a buy-in. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something that I think a lot of risk folks miss. Their history has been so steeped in downside volatility. ERM is a quantum difference. It's looking at upside and downside, risk reward in a disciplined way.
Yes.
Both to provide business decision makers with, here's the picture. What trade-offs do we want? What is the optimal level of risk? Do we need to take more risk, and how much more can we take? And so that we need the right framework for that. But what you're saying is, if they have that, and maybe the right chief risk officer will institute a framework like that, and then be able to have a little bit more receptivity in marketing that around the organization.
Yeah. Yes, it's also often you get into organization where you're doing business across the different environment, different country, and the risk appetite or the risk vision, or sometimes the regulatory environment is such that you're looking at risk various ways. And I think ERM has this advantage of, I guess, it kinds of level off, like all the different regulations. And risk appetite, and with the different, I guess, products. If we're talking insurance, which I guess is my my background.
Yeah. So you've shared with us some of the skills and characteristics and qualities that a chief risk officer needs. Hopefully, we haven't scared off too many people from trying to become a chief risk officer. But let me just get a little bit of a different question. What are the risks? Obviously, there's risks of not having an ERM program, but what are some of the risks in an ERM program itself, in that process?
Some of the risk we've talked about earlier, in the sense that if you have like a too rigid of a framework and all the same risk, and you repeat, and I guess the risk is having it an automatic kind of table or whatever that you fill in, and then so you look at risk one by one, and this is covered, and you do the calculation. You need to re-question it regularly. The other, I guess, risk that you may have is defining risk and calculate and looking at it is somewhat subjective. Even though you want to put a lot of math in there, there's always some subjectivity. And the risk is that you're trying to take some risk and justify it through ERM. So it becomes an advocate to take on more risk. So you have to keep, I guess, the balance. You don't want to go too much risk adverse, or you don't want to go and just using it to justify some of the risk that you're taking. You really want to keep an objective view on the risk.
That's a really good point, because it needs to be a couple of things. It needs to be a living, breathing, evolving process. It can't be. It's not an exercise. You're not done with it, right? It's just it's flying at a little bit higher level, a little bit different way, better way of making business decisions, and it can't be viewed as a checklist. And in addition to being a living, breathing part of being a living and breathing process is you need to connect with the people. So knowing your people, this is something a chief risk officer really has to do, because you need to draw on the people that are, again, closest to the business, closest to that part of the risk, and get the assumptions from them. Because a lot of these assumptions, there aren't data on, are we going to be able to execute the strategy? Is the strategy right to begin with? What would our competitor, might our competitor do to us? These types of risks. But again, or technology failures, these things are, a lot of it's subjective, and people have their biases. So a chief risk officer knows their people. Some people are more risk averse, some people are more risk takers, some people are trying to push a project ahead, and the chief risk officer has a right and responsibility to push back on those assumptions. And it's also, of course, good to have an outside consultant who's maybe done this from a number of organizations that can push back and say, well, why do you think this would blow everything up for 6 months when most companies it's 2 weeks of overtime and a quick workaround? So that balance you're talking about is a very important point of, you need to get assumptions from people, but you also need some consistency, and that's another heavy burden on the chief risk officer.
But it does make the job quite interesting.
Quite interesting.
Yes.
So thank you, Micheline. You've given our chief risk officers out there a lot to think about.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.